By the early months of 1943, German intelligence assessments of the United States military were finalized. Analysts in Berlin labeled the arriving American forces as Britain's Italians. The phrase was a precise calculation. It suggested America would provide the same quantity of enthusiastic incompetence that Italy had provided to the Axis cause. This assessment was grounded in observable data. The Wehrmacht possessed the most sophisticated military system on Earth. The Americans possessed industrial capacity, but lacked a cohesive doctrine for modern mechanized warfare. The collision of these two realities would occur in a North African mountain pass. The result was not just a defeat. It became the foundational data set for the most rapid institutional restructuring in modern military history. In 18 months, a shattered army would systematically identify its structural failures, purge its command hierarchy, and engineer a tactical framework that would dismantle the German armored corps. The transformation began with a catastrophe. Think about what the Wehrmacht had actually seen by February 1943. Against every opponent they had faced across Europe and North Africa, they had prevailed. They executed a philosophy of war refined through years of continuous combat. Their combined arms doctrine integrated armor, infantry, and air support into a seamless operational instrument. The German command structure delegated tactical decisions to the lowest competent level, maintaining high operational velocity. Across the front line, the United States Second Corps presented a stark structural contrast. The American command architecture was fundamentally disjointed. The Corps commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, operated from a subterranean bunker blasted into a ravine. This headquarters was located 70 miles behind the active front lines. Distance from the engagement zone degrades situational awareness. Fredendall compounded this geographical isolation through his communication protocols. He transmitted orders to his subordinate officers using a bizarre personal code. His own staff struggled to decipher the terminology. Essential tactical directives were delayed or misinterpreted during translation. An army relies on the rapid transmission of precise information. The Second Corps operated in an information vacuum. Leadership was disconnected from the physical reality of the terrain. Subordinate units were isolated from mutual support. The American forces were deployed across the Tunisian landscape not as a synchronized military instrument, but as a collection of static targets waiting for an initiation sequence. The German High Command recognized the structural vulnerabilities immediately. The tactical deployment of the Second Corps defied basic principles of modern warfare. The stage was set for a systematic dismantling. The Wehrmacht did not need to invent new tactics. They only needed to execute their standard operational procedures against an opponent structurally incapable of responding. The impending collision was a matter of basic military mathematics. The operational directives issued to American armored units reflected a profound misunderstanding of mechanized combat. When the U.S. Second Corps initiated offensive actions, they advanced in parade ground formations. Tanks moved across the desert floor in neat V shapes. The geometry mirrored cavalry charges from a previous century. It was a tactical application completely divorced from the lethality of 20th century munitions. The geometry maximized exposure. A single anti-tank position could engage multiple targets without adjusting its primary field of fire. Modern armor doctrine requires synchronized support. The American advances featured no infantry coordination. Tanks rolled forward without screening elements to clear entrenched positions. There was no artillery integration to suppress enemy strongpoints before the armor arrived. There was no reconnaissance deployed to identify the disposition of German defenders. The armored columns simply drove into contested territory. operating on the assumption that massed steel was sufficient. The German defenders observed these formations approaching with mechanical predictability. Anti-tank gunners measured the distances, calibrated their optics, and waited for the American vehicles to enter optimal effective range. The V-shaped formations concentrated the American tanks into dense target clusters. If the lead vehicle was disabled, the trailing vehicles were forced to halt or maneuver through restricted lanes, multiplying their vulnerability. A tank without infantry support is blind. A tank without artillery support is exposed. The Second Corps stripped its armored units of every protective layer required for survival on a modern battlefield. The command structure had engineered a tactical environment where failure was the only probability. The American forces were maneuvering according to obsolete peacetime theories. The German forces were preparing to apply the physics of modern ballistics. The theoretical phase of the American deployment was over. February 19, 1943. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel launched the Afrika Korps against the American positions at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The offensive was initiated precisely where the American command structure was most fragmented. What followed was not a battle, it was confirmation. The German assault columns struck the American lines with concentrated armor and mechanized infantry. The defensive perimeter disintegrated upon contact. The 1st Armored Division was the primary American formation in the sector. Rommel's Panzers scattered the division across 30 miles of desert. The displacement occurred in a matter of hours. Command and control networks collapsed entirely. Units were cut off, surrounded, and systematically reduced. 30 miles of terrain was surrendered without a coordinated defensive action. Radio frequencies filled with frantic, uncoordinated transmissions before falling silent. The bizarre personal codes used by the Corps headquarters proved useless in managing a fluid, high-velocity retreat. Officers in the rear echelon lost all tracking of their forward battalions. The American doctrine of static defense and parade ground counterattacks was tested against a kinetic, multi-axis assault. The doctrine failed. Panzers bypassed strongpoints, severed supply lines, and engaged American armor in isolated pockets. The mechanized advantage belonged entirely to the attacker. American tank crews found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned, fighting disconnected skirmishes without central direction. The desert terrain offered no concealment from the advancing German columns. Retreating units abandoned their heavy equipment to accelerate their withdrawal. The operational map at the German headquarters showed a rapid, uninterrupted advance through the pass. The operational map at the American headquarters showed nothing, as accurate situation reports ceased to arrive. The theory of American armored capability had been exposed to the reality of the Wehrmacht. The physical reality of Kasserine Pass was defined by burning metal and abandoned positions. German armored columns moved through the valley floor at a sustained cruising speed, methodically neutralizing remaining pockets of resistance. Smoke columns marked the locations of destroyed American vehicles, stretching back toward the western horizon. The logistical infrastructure of the Second Corps was left intact for German appropriation. Ammunition dumps, fuel reserves, and supply depots were overrun before they could be destroyed by retreating personnel. The American command apparatus was paralyzed. Inside the subterranean headquarters, miles from the engagement, a gloved hand brushed a layer of fine dust off a magnifying glass. The glass hovered over the topographical map. The grease pencil markings indicating American defensive lines were no longer valid. The lines were erased. The communication cables connecting the bunker to the front had been physically severed by advancing German tracks. There were no reinforcements to deploy. There was no secondary defensive line constructed to absorb the breakthrough. The infantry units that had not been enveloped were moving backward on foot, having lost their transport vehicles. The artillery batteries that had not been flanked were out of ammunition. The armor that had not been destroyed was scattered in the hills, incapable of reforming into a cohesive strike force. The Wehrmacht had executed a textbook penetration and exploitation maneuver. The American forces had provided zero friction to the German advance. It was a tactical execution that required minimal adjustment from the German commanders. They simply drove through the gaps created by American structural incompetence. The silence settling over the pass was the sound of an entire military philosophy expiring in the desert. The operational accounting of the engagement was compiled. Over 6,500 personnel were lost. Roughly 20% of the engaged force simply ceased to exist as a fighting unit. The debris field stretched for miles across the valley floor. Track marks pressed deep into the sand. Wind moved through the open hatches of charred hulls. Metal cooled. Every military institution faces a catastrophic failure. The standard response is rationalization. Armies blame weather, intelligence gaps, or insufficient supply lines to protect their command structures. The institutional reflex is to preserve the hierarchy. The American Army did not see Kasserine as a defeat to be rationalized. It treated Kasserine as a data set. The disaster was stripped of its emotional weight and processed as raw information. The structural flaws had been exposed, and the exposure was documented. Within days of the collapse, surviving officers were filing after-action reports. These documents contained a level of institutional honesty that was, by the standards of any army in that war, extraordinary. They detailed the failure of the V-shaped formations. They documented the inadequacy of the anti-tank munitions. They mapped the fatal delays in the communication network. The failure was quantified. The command hierarchy accepted the data without defensive posturing. The vulnerability was recognized. This was the pivot. This was the moment the trajectory of the war shifted. The American military apparatus stopped operating on assumptions and began operating on evidence. The dataset revealed that enthusiasm could not compensate for systemic incompetence. The initial German assessment had been accurate, but the American response to that accuracy would alter the balance of power. The blood spilled at Kasserine purchased the operational blueprint for the rest of the conflict. The data demanded a ruthless internal purge. When the analysis of the dataset was complete, the Army executed a directive that sounds simple but represents the most difficult action any institution can take. It fired the individuals who failed. It replaced them with individuals who understood the analysis. Major General Lloyd Fredendall was removed from command on March 6, 1943. The subterranean headquarters was abandoned. The bizarre personal codes were discarded. The replacement commander was George S. Patton. Patton was not sent to boost morale. He was sent to enforce the new tactical reality derived from the Kasserine data. He had exactly 17 days to transform a shattered corps before the German forces initiated their next offensive. The Americans proved to be systematic, relentless, institutional learners. They demonstrated a genuine willingness to discard doctrine that was not working. They replaced it with doctrine derived directly from what actually happened in combat. This adaptation occurred sometimes within days of an engagement. Under Patton, the Second Corps was restructured. Infantry, artillery, and armor were forcibly integrated. Reconnaissance patrols were mandated before any armored advance. The parade ground formations were banned permanently. Vehicles were dispersed to minimize target density. Communication protocols were standardized, ensuring clear, rapid transmission of orders from the front line to the artillery batteries. The command staff was purged of officers who could not adapt to the accelerated operational tempo. The entire logistical pipeline was reconfigured to support mobile, combined arms warfare. The The 17-day window was a period of ruthless operational calibration. The theoretical army that had arrived in North Africa was dismantled piece by piece. A pragmatic, data-driven machine was constructed in its place. The German High Command remained unaware of the internal restructuring. They assumed the opponent they faced in late March was the same opponent they had routed in February. March 1943, El Guitar, Tunisia. The German 10th Panzer Division initiated a dawn attack down the valley. They committed the bulk of their available armor to the assault. They expected to scatter the American defenders as they had done at Kasserine. What they found instead was a kill zone. American infantry held the high ground, spotting the advance. Standardized communication lines relayed the coordinates instantly. Artillery batteries, now synchronized with the forward observers, saturated the valley floor. It was the first time American forces had defeated an experienced German armored formation in open battle. The data from Kasserine had been successfully applied. This localized victory initiated the construction of a massive tactical framework. Over the next 18 months, America built operational pillars designed to neutralize specific German advantages. First, artillery response times were compressed. A forward observer could call for fire support and receive it within 3 minutes. German artillery typically required a half hour. Second, dedicated tank destroyer doctrine was finalized. The M18 Hellcat was deployed with a tactical doctrine built around 3 precise actions: ambush, kill, relocate. Third, industrial production was optimized for volume. The ratio on medium and heavy tanks eventually exceeded 6-to-1 in America's favor. Fourth, the logistical replacement cycle was perfected. Disabled vehicles were recovered, repaired, and returned to the front with industrial efficiency. The American system was no longer designed to win individual tank duels. It was designed to overwhelm the German operational capacity through speed, mass, and synchronized firepower. The machine was calibrated. The doctrine of massed integrated lethality replaced the parade ground theories of the past. The system was ready for the European continent. The Battle of Arracourt commenced in September 1944. It served as the final validation of the system. American armored forces, utilizing better intelligence, integrated tactics, and terrain exploitation, engaged 2 elite Panzer brigades. The engagement lasted 11 days. Post-war analysis examining armor engagements found that American formations achieved a 3.6-to-1 kill ratio against the heavier German Panthers. The logistical framework sustained the momentum. The 3rd Armored Division entered the Normandy campaign with an initial fleet of Shermans, yet recorded a 580% replacement cycle by war's end. The United States Army of February 1943 was routed at Kasserine Pass. The United States Army of September 1944 annihilated elite Panzer formations using tanks acknowledged as individually inferior to their opponents. 18 months. The same basic equipment, the same training pipeline, radically different results. The shift from enthusiastic incompetence to armored dominance required a catalyst. The foundation of the deadliest armor system in the world was built entirely on the institutional willingness to treat failure as information.